Welcome back to Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. I'm your host, Joel Bryce. On today's episode, we're skipping the intros and getting right to today's subject. It's the results of the 2025 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. Joining me on today's episode are two familiar faces, Dr. Frank Rohwer, President and Chief Scientist, and John Devney, Delta's Chief Policy Officer. How you doing, guys?
Good.
Great.
The much-anticipated day is here.
Yep.
What is today, September 2nd?
September 2nd.
Yeah, there was a little chatter about these results coming out a little bit later than usual, but I think maybe it's good to remind everybody that was probably 5 or 6 months ago, at least, when somebody said these results were coming.
Right. Yeah. We've known that the service has been under stress to produce these results, and now that we set regulations a year early, it's not a big deal. Whether they come in August or September, it's still exciting news to duck hunters to get the survey results and see what they might expect.
Perfect. Before we get into the discussion, we're not gonna linger very long, but I do have an important statement to read about this survey. The Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey and the Waterfowl Status Report are the result of a collaborative effort conducted annually by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, and the Atlantic, Mississippi, Central, and Pacific Flyway Councils. In other words, this is quite a comprehensive exercise.
It's a heck of a big survey. I mean, it's the biggest annual wildlife survey in the world, and it's pretty remarkable how much area the service and the Canadian Wildlife Service and the councils cover. So it's a remarkable survey, and we in the waterfowl world are lucky to have, this is one of the 3 great data sets that we consistently look at. So
I think one of the other interesting things, if we'd go back, there was some questions as to whether or not this survey was going to take place, as you recall, John.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was, the migratory bird program of the Fish and Wildlife Service has been sort of in a pretty significant state of decline going all the way back to 2010. Lots of priorities, less resources. And so we were hearing rumblings back in February and March that there was some concern that the survey wouldn't happen at all. And as Frank pointed out, I don't think that's a world we want to live in.
Oh, absolutely.
This is not only is it important for decision making and setting annual regulations and the stuff it does, but I think even more importantly is this is a feedback mechanism duck hunters who have demonstrated to be the greatest conservationists expect. And we can think back to those years during COVID where we were kind of flying blind without the benefit of surveys, and it concerned hunters, and appropriately so. I mean, we've been conditioned to having good access to good information for a long time, and candidly, that's the only state that I think we should find ourselves living in the future. We got to make sure that these surveys and the other annual monitoring programs continue to be a huge priority for the Fish and Wildlife Service.
It is good news to have this conversation.
Yep.
Absolutely. So not to bury the lead, I'll just hit a couple of the big numbers, just because people, if you're listening to this one first, we'll have a press release. You guys did a nice, I think it was about a 5-minute video. Is that about right?
Yeah.
So if you're loyal to the podcast and haven't heard those, go look for those as well, more in short form. But in short, this year's breeding population, pretty much the same as last year. Ponds down from last year, not by a little, but by a fair bit.
A lot. Yeah.
And then the Eastern Survey area is a positive message. And then on the Pacific Flyway, John, a bit of a positive message
California, best breeding numbers in quite some time after many, many years of decline.
Frank, I don't know. This isn't rehearsed, absolutely. So the BPOP being very similar to nearly identical, 33.99 million last year, 33.98 million breeding ducks this year. Is that what you expected?
Absolutely not. I thought after last year, another really dry year on the prairies, that we would see a fairly substantial drop in duck numbers, and that just didn't happen. We're 10,000 different from last year. That's spot on. That's remarkable. And to me, it shows that ducks are doggone resilient. They did okay in places that we're not sure where that was, but they did okay. And we had a liberal season last year. 6 and 60 for most of the mid-continent and yet ducks did just fine. So I think that shows you ducks are pretty tough.
What stands out for you, John, about
You
those
know,
numbers?
I was surprised too. And the reason I was really surprised is, Fortress Eastern Dakota, which has been sort of where we've had the lion's share of the breeding pairs, and I would argue that, overwhelming majority of any good news of production over the last number of years based on a little bit wetter conditions, and then, pretty a few timely summer rains the last couple of years. We probably had pockets of production in the Eastern Dakotas. Looking at it, last fall we were dry. We had a non-winter winter, not much runoff. We had some nice rains in early May, but I was worried that we've had Prairie Canada be dry for so long that all of a sudden that drought appeared to be coming to the Eastern Dakotas, and I was worried that without the Eastern Dakotas carrying the load that they have historically, that would reveal itself in a lot lower duck numbers. And yeah, surprised for sure, especially for mallards and pintail, the early nesters that probably got here before we had the benefit of those late rains.
Yeah. So, yeah, with ponds way down, we expected ducks to be down a lot, and frankly, John and I were both surprised at the numbers. So,
Yeah.
and it's interesting that there seemed to be a redistribution, even though several key areas. You think about great areas: the Eastern Dakotas, Southern Saskatchewan, Southern Alberta, and then Southern Manitoba. Well, 3 of those 4 areas, pond numbers were down, and yet duck numbers were up. So ducks settled where they traditionally do. Last year, mallard numbers were just wonky. I mean, they weren't in the traditional areas that I just mentioned, and they were in northern BC and the boreal forest.
Northwest boreal forest, yeah.
So it was a very different count from last year in terms of where the ducks were. Same numbers. So
Yeah, I think another way to kind of phrase what you were saying there is that, well, we talk all the time about it in that distribution of water and timing of water are
Yes.
two things that people really need to look after. And the U.S. prairies being dry is typically not a good thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing at all this year, but it is so interesting. And timing of water, I think that's one of the things that we discussed is that at least the last couple of years, by the water turned on the last
Right.
couple of years after the ducks had already settled.
And that happened in North Dakota this year. I mean, I have not seen it so dry in early, when the ducks were being counted for this, what we call the May survey. And then we got a lot of rain. And surprisingly, duck numbers were down in the Dakotas and pond counts were way down in the Eastern Dakotas. I mean, we're 40% below last year, more or less. And then you look at a North Dakota survey. Now I'm talking about a different survey. This is done by North Dakota Game and Fish, and they had brood counts being up, and so that just shows you that it's not just where ducks are settling and the numbers that settle, but renesting, nest success, and brood survival also are pretty important to duck production, which is what I think hunters look to this report, as John mentioned earlier. It's a really important report for hunters. They look to it to see, what can I expect in my duck line? And it might not be as bad as the pond numbers would suggest. When brood counts are up 28% from last year, that's surprising to me. That's an interesting, and that shows that the ducks that settled here in North Dakota, they renested persistently. They probably had fair nest success and maybe good brood survival.
Good brood survival. Yeah.
Yeah, at the end of this discussion, I will ask everyone's, I'll throw mine in too, everyone's kind of fall flight forecast.
Right.
And, we all spend a varying amount of time on the prairies throughout the spring and summer, both in Canada. Frank, you've been up. I haven't been up to Canada this year. That's one of the first field seasons I haven't been up north. But I think just to kind of move on from ponds, the pond count was way down. It deserves that qualifier. 19% down from last year and 20% below the long-term average.
Right.
And Saskatchewan, I don't know if this one caught me off guard or not, up 4% from last year, but still 27% down from the long-term average. So you're basically talking about a real dry trend that's pulled that LTA down quite a bit.
Yeah.
So moving on to everybody. Well, it's not everybody. It's not my favorite duck, although I like to shoot them. Yeah, mallards down only 1% from last year.
Right.
17% down from the long-term average, though. So, what is it that Frank? What is it that mallards need to get back on track? And in other words, how quickly can they bounce back compared to other species of ducks?
Well, I think when you look at mallards, technically they should be able to bounce back at least as well as any duck out there. They're the king of renesting, so they start early, they end late, they renest a lot. And when conditions are great, mallards can really take off. So they're the most abundant duck in the world and in North America by a long shot. And they're that way because they're a great generalist and they show really strong breeding activity when it's wet. So, mallards are at what, a little over 6.5 million now. They used to be at 12 million, but that was back when we had 8 million ponds on the landscape.
Right.
Around in the decade from 1995 to you count those next 20 years. That was an incredibly wet period.
Mhm.
Yeah, we had some fluky years.
Yep.
John, you pointed out to me, a while ago that 2002, it was crazy dry, much drier than this year. But that was a short-term blip, and mostly we had all this water. So you get a lot of water, and mallards are like other, like blue wings and pintails. They really love that shallow, temporary, small wetlands, shallow water. That's what really sets mallard breeding apart. Gadwall, are a different duck. They like deeper, semi-permanent ponds. So all we need is a few good years, and mallard numbers will be, right back to 8-10 million.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Frank pointed out, I mean, mallards have incredible, occupy huge parts of, you go into western Minnesota, and if you're going to see a breeding duck, what are you going to see? You're going to see a mallard, right?
Mhm.
You go into the woods in Minnesota, and you're going to see a mallard, and so they can spread their risk out really well. But then when conditions improve, they can take advantage of it incredibly quickly because, heck, Frank, there's nobody close that renests like
Right.
mallards do,
Right,
right?
yeah.
And so, but yeah, I mean, I thought the fascinating thing, we were all scratching our head a little bit when we saw this report a year ago and saw those mallards show up kind of in odd areas, central and northern Alberta, northeast British Columbia, and the Northwest Territories was a big source of where mallards was sort of the place where they were last year. Despite pond counts not being great in Prairie Canada, we had big increases. Well, I mean, sizable increases in southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, southern Manitoba, and even though the eastern Dakotas were dry, mallard numbers were up a little bit. Still, I mean, in all those places, mallards are well below the long-term average. But the year-over-year change, and having them on the prairies versus, in the northwest part of the boreal forest is a pretty significant change year over year. And knowing what we know about mallards is they must have got up here and just sort of poked around and found the best available places where they could set up for the breeding season.
Rig'em Right is an industry leader in high-quality waterfowl hunting gear and proud partner of Delta Waterfowl. From blind bags, backpacks, and gun cases to dog vests, dog stands, and dog blinds, Rig'em Right has you and your hunting dog covered for long days in the duck marsh. And even more exciting, Rig'em Right has launched its new mainline series decoys that are lightweight, durable, and they look awesome. Check out Rig'em Right's complete lineup at www.rig'emright.com or wherever you buy your hunting gear. Moving on from mallards, I guess the take home there is the water comes back, so will the mallards.
Yeah.
And I do think that we tend to, I do it. It seems like, oh, it's an earlier spring, it's a later spring, it's a this, it's a that, it's a warmer summer. There's more mosquitoes this year than ever, but then when you sit down and you actually kind of look at the data, it's not always exceptional. Sometimes it is, but there have been dry periods since the history of the survey.
Oh, yeah.
Water will come back, the mallards will come back.
Right.
Although I do think there has been quite a bit of grassland habitat lost from maybe that last big, huge positive trend in mallards. So maybe it won't come back. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think they'll come back all the way to that level?
I doubt if we're going to reach 12 million mallards again, based on the loss of CRP and the continued loss of wetlands, the permanent loss of wetlands. You know, in the last few years in Prairie Canada, it's been so dry that any large farmer has the equipment to be able to drain small wetlands and into large wetlands. That's typically what happens, and that consolidation drainage really hurts the things that like small wetlands, pintails, mallard, teal. So I doubt that we'll get back to those numbers, but water washes away all evils. So if we had an incredibly wet year again, I think you'd see mallards way back up again and fabulous duck hunting years again.
So moving on, pintail, gadwall, widgeon, all rows.
Isn't that interesting? And I think that I have to believe that's showing that the Arctic and the boreal is a little more important than we've given it credit for, and particularly for pintails. Pintails in the Arctic have done reasonably well, and pintails in the prairies have had a tough 20 years now, partly because of habitat changes, loss of wetlands, dry conditions, and partly because of the standing stubble that pintails are attracted to, nest in, and have terrible nest success. So, but yeah, isn't that interesting that some ducks are still well above long-term average, like gadwall.
The interesting thing about the pintail, and it's one of these things you always have to read these reports and be a little careful about it. I mean, we counted about absolute 0 pintails in southern Alberta last year.
Yeah.
I mean, it was probably, I don't know that it was, but if it wasn't, it was probably close to the lowest pintail estimate we've ever had in southern Alberta, which is pretty darn important pintail country, especially if you're a duck hunter in California. It's historically been really important for California, been really important for the Texas Gulf Coast too. We had a 192% increase in pintails in southern Alberta. That sounds awesome until you recognize that we're still 80% below the long-term average. And the other thing that's really interesting about pintail is Frank talked about these incredible wet conditions coupled with, some CRP, certainly less today, but pintail numbers in the eastern Dakotas, we had seen this sort of radical departure from historical pintail distribution, which always used to be around southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan. And all of a sudden, the eastern Dakotas became a really, really, really important place for pintail. Well, that's fallen apart now. We had a big decline in pintail, interestingly, this year in the eastern Dakotas. And now we're way below the LTA long-term average for pintails in the eastern Dakotas, too. And, some of the rest of the news out of the eastern Dakotas isn't great or is not so bad. That one caught my attention. There's another one that caught my attention. We'll catch up to that one later. But, yeah, I mean, to see pintails up in all 3 prairie provinces, again, even though some pretty terrible numbers last year, was a nice sign to see.
Frank, you're quoted as saying that widgeon numbers defy logic. What does that mean?
I mean, widgeon are way up, and I used to think, I remember working as an assistant back in the 70s, in the heart of widgeon country, in southwestern Saskatchewan, and that area is so dry, and yet widgeon did great, and so I have to believe that a lot of those widgeon came out of the subarctic and Arctic. So, I don't know. How can they be up that much when pond numbers are down? And we've been in this long-term dry condition. And unlike pintails, widgeon aren't, they're not breeding in the Dakotas. They really are a prairie and Arctic nesting duck. And so, that's a surprising one.
Yeah, the bright spot, up 115% in southern Alberta.
Yeah.
And up 39% in Alaska, the Yukon Territory, Old Crow Flats. So that's one of my favorite birds. So that's good news for me.
Well, and it wasn't that long ago.
We were worried.
We're worried. I mean, you got widgeon populations were down, down low 2 millions, I think, in some of those years. And so and I think for those of us that are duck hunters, imagine having a bag limit or species restriction on widgeon, which are pretty ubiquitous duck
Yeah.
and pretty gray.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of us were fearful we were going to get into the place where we had to have a widgeon harvest strategy
Yeah.
that freaked us out a little bit. So it's nice to see them have a bit of a recovery.
I completely agree with John. Adult male widgeons are gorgeous and easy to identify. You get those juvenile females or female widgeon, and they come in, and it's just like, well, that's a duck. I don't know. So that'd be a tough one for duck hunters to have to deal with a restricted 3-bird, 2-bird bag limit in the 6-duck limit. So it's great to see widgeon recovering nicely. Another surprising one I think were lesser scaup. We just like pintails that John was talking about, the eastern Dakotas when they were really wet, it was a remarkable redistribution, and scaup were doing great. Well, the eastern Dakotas are doggone dry right now, and scaup weren't there, but we think of the boreal as being fairly stable, and yet scaup dropped 10%, and that's the one that's probably going to cause trouble for next year's hunting regulations, because we've been in these, and let's face it, hunters hate this, seasons within seasons or restrictive bag limits, and it'll be a surprise if those don't happen.
Well, and I think, scaup, we talked about ducks like pintail and blue wings and mallards that love those small, shallow wetlands. Scaup are a little bit harder wired to a little bit more permanent water.
Yeah.
But the decline of CRP, I think, is what's finally catching us with scaup. For those of you that don't ever spend time on the breeding grounds and deal with scaup on the breeding grounds, it's a miracle there are any. Their feet are way too far in the back to nest on the ground. They're a car crash every time you're nest dragging. They're kind of, but if you look at them and you look at their population trajectories, they followed all the upland nestling dabbling ducks up in this wet period, and they stayed there for a long time. And Dr. Todd Arnold had a graduate student looking at sensitivity analysis of scaup populations across the entirety of their breeding range. And the eastern Dakotas, when he did that analysis, were the lone bright spot. And to have them sort of struggling here now, I think, is for guys that like to bomb around on big water and lay in layout boats and shoot black and white ducks. This is not good news for those guys at all.
Yeah, the scaup are amazing. As John pointed out, they nest in the uplands, and that's very different from the other divers that you think of, canvasbacks and redheads, that stay in the pond and build their nest, in the cattail. So they're nesting over water, and they just lay the cattail down, and that's typically a much safer way to nest. And so this year, one of the other surprises were cans and redheads were both up, and scaup were down 10%, and the others were up, more than 10%, and so that's another oddity in this report. Not hugely surprising, because redheads and canvasbacks are not nesting up in the boreal. The majority of scaup are up in the boreal forest, and cans and redheads are in the parklands and the prairies when the prairies are wet. So,
and their numbers were up.
Their
Redheads
numbers
and
were
cans.
up. Now canvasbacks are probably the most stable duck. If you look at the duck numbers from 1955 to present, people think canvasback go up and down a lot. They don't really. They stay right around 700,000, and they're remarkably flat. And that's probably because they breed in the parklands, and the parklands are virtually always have water.
So it's more of their habitat selection. They're selecting just by definition more stable habitat.
Yeah, and redheads fluctuate a lot more and have fluctuated a lot more than canvasbacks. But redheads do something interesting. They breed down in the prairies of the Dakotas, and canvasbacks are pretty scarce here in North Dakota. They really start in the parklands. So.
On the bluebills, the upland nesting, I remember 25 years ago, some of the early predator management work that we were doing in that Can-Do, northern North Dakota area. I do remember how it was very noteworthy that we were finding so many bluebill nesting up in the
it was remarkable. I remember ponds that bluebills will do this interesting behavior called creshing, where multiple females get together and they just pool their broods. And we had creshes on ponds that were 20 acres. That's a big pond in the Dakotas, but We had creches of over 300 ducklings. Like, it was awesome. You had the trifecta. Fox fell out of the system. We were trapping. You had great CRP and a lot of water, and bluebills were everywhere. We would go out and find 40 bluebill nests in a morning. I remember having guys from Arkansas came up, and they couldn't come early. And Arkansas is, let's face it, they're Mallard boys. And they came up, but they came up in July. So we're nest searching late when mallards had already hatched. And we found 40 bluebill nests, and they were like, what the heck is going on? But that's what's nesting. Bluebills tend to be late nesters as well. So, and we went out and found a ton of bluebill nests, and it was very interesting. And now you can go to Candu, North Dakota, and drive around and see 2 bluebill broods in 25 miles. It's
Really changed.
It's sad. It's changed.
Well, a ton of that grass is gone.
Yes.
Right.
So that does make a lot of sense that they really followed. Maybe they expanded their range. Was it an expansion into the Dakotas, or?
I wouldn't say expansion of range because they had always been there, but a huge expansion in numbers.
In productivity.
Productivity.
I mean, I think, and they're pretty philopatric, right? So they're a duck that tends to come back, and their daughters come back. And so I think we literally, and I think it was the same thing that happened with Pintail, is we, of years of great production, good water. Frank mentioned the fox falling out of the system, abundant CRP, plenty of other native grass too. And, those ducks just boomed. And Pintail and Scott were, again, nobody was thinking about Pintail and Scott breeding in the eastern Dakotas. If you talked to biologists in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they would have said, no, it's inconsequential. Don't worry about it. Well, in the last 25 years, the eastern Dakota's been hugely consequential, those 2 species.
Let's move on to something a little more. There's a little bright spot here, and that's Pintail limits.
Right.
So hunters not that long ago got the great news about a 3-bird Pintail bag. The counts looking ahead into next hunting season. Somebody want to touch on that?
Yeah, the count being up, substantially, or a good margin means that we're going to stick with this 3-bird Pintail limit, which is great for hunters. We've been in ridiculously low harvest rates for pintails, and the hope was that low harvest would cause populations to rebound, and that's clearly not the case. Generally, hunting has very little to do with duck numbers. Duck numbers are driven by what happens on the breeding grounds, and particularly in the prairie pothole region. And so, this year is just a great example of that. We had a liberal season, and yet ducks did just fine, even though we were remarkably dry last year. And so great news for pintail hunters that you're going to have the option to be able to shoot 3 pintails. So.
Now, not every state picked that up. Is that right?
Yeah, a few states said that we're going to stick with 1, and states can always go more restrictive than the federal limits. It's not common that happens, but pintails are an interesting one where a few states have opted to do that. So.
Well, hunters travel.
Yeah.
Right. A lot.
Yeah.
That's been a huge change.
Yeah.
I think in my time as an adult. So interesting. If you're looking at the southern Canadian prairie provinces, ducks are up.
Yeah.
Ponds down.
Yeah.
I know we were talking about the park or about the boreal. We're talking about points north.
Yeah.
But we're just restricting that discussion to the southern Canadian prairies. How do you reconcile that?
The only thing I can come up with is, Frank said, we haven't seen the age ratios yet, so we can't. So we don't have we'll get those, I think, later this week, so we can see how different duck species fared in different flyways last year, which gives us a really good benchmark of what productivity was last year.
Right.
Now Frank mentioned, maybe there are places in the Arctic or the boreal that were producing more ducks than we understood. And I think, when we were talking about the breeding survey last year and sort of prognosticating about the fall flight, and I think we're seeing a similar thing play out this year, although maybe at a grander scale, is timely rains and that opportunity, Frank mentioned the North Dakota Game and Fish Survey having a pretty sizable increase in the number of broods they surveyed. That's with less ducks, right? But more broods with less ducks tells you that flush of water that we received probably kicked in a re-nesting effort and probably helped with, we know it helps with duckling survival. We know wetlands
Always.
drive wetland conditions in late summer drive duckling survival. So is it possible we had just enough pockets of good production last year to carry the day? And I was looking at the map in preparation to do this, and there were a few areas on sort of the qualitative side, the maps the Fish and Wildlife Service does, that the pilot biologists sort of characterize habitat, very qualitative. But there were a few areas that looked like they improved from last year to this year. And was there just enough places to soak up those ducks that, at least for a number of species, the eastern Dakotas didn't attract? They went into places. Southwestern Manitoba is a small area. Southwestern Manitoba saw a big influx of ducks. And so did we have enough production last year? Those ducks overflew the eastern Dakotas, and those ducks found enough places to settle in the Canadian prairies. I mean, that's all I can conjure out of this, Frank, having a few minutes to look at it.
Yeah, I agree with John. John made a good point a moment ago that we tend to put too much stock in the May duck numbers, and what really matters is what's coming to your decoys in the fall, and that's a function of how many ducks you start with, and then what's the nest success, and then how many females re-nest, lay a replacement clutch after a skunk eats their first clutch, and then what's brood survival. And brood survival is really interesting because it's a one and done thing. There are very few ducks north of the Mason-Dixon line that when they fail with a set of ducklings, they re-nest. Right. That just doesn't happen up here in the prairies. And so, brood survival is a big driver, and I think probably a really important driver when you have these kind of marginal conditions. And when we had, and this happened across Saskatchewan as well, that after the May surveys, we got a fair amount of rain. There are some areas that have been bone dry, were completely dry this spring, and then they had ponds when I saw them in July, and I'm thinking, this isn't normal. And so now, if they're bone dry in the spring, they didn't have any ducks settle. But if you're just moderate, you have a few ducks settle, and then you get this water happening, you can get fair production. And so, the North Dakota Brood Survey up 28%, and we're down a huge number in May when we did the pond counts, but 28% is a pretty big increase.
Yeah,
so
I think
so
there's
that
a lot
happens because of re-nesting and brood survival.
Well, you can have. I think I was trying to draw this box in my head. So you can start out wet, and you can finish wet, and that's a absolute bumper crop.
That's what we want.
Those are great years.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you could start out dry,
Yeah.
attract fewer pairs, but then finish wet, so you raise a lot of ducks, and that sounds like maybe what we had in the Dakotas this year.
Yeah.
But then you can go start out wet and dry, and then you end up with less production.
Yeah. Right.
Survival's lower, less re-nesting.
Right.
And I think we've all experienced every one of those conditions.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And we've started dry and ended dry.
Yeah.
Right, which is really terrible.
That's the turd right there. Yeah.
But and the thing about it is, and I don't know what the literature says about it in the prairies, but it's pretty. You take a duck, you can take mallards in the Central Valley of California as an example. It seems to be there's years where they kind of sit around and wait for the water to come. Then the water comes and they go nest, and it's a hard, really crazy hard thing to measure at big scales like in the prairies, but do ducks sort of get that signal that, hey, we've been sitting around eating bugs, waiting for something to happen, and then you get a nice bunch of May rains, and, it makes intuitive sense for a species like a duck to take advantage of that rapidly changing wetland condition because all the resources are there now.
Let's talk about some production predictions. So you did talk about the Dakotas, but you talked about the Dakotas because it's basically the only place that has a brood survey to talk about.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not aware of one in Canada, South Dakota, other than maybe discrete research projects.
Yep.
So all we can do is look in our crystal ball. But so North Dakota, we already said, brood numbers up. What about Canada? Any thoughts there?
I think overall it's just going to be an average or below average year. I mean, it's hard to imagine you're going to have great duck production when we are so dry. But, maybe I'll be surprised. And if next year, I'm not going to predict next year's numbers being way down
After
get hit in the
penny
nose
kicking we took here in the
this
last
year.
yeah.
I just have to say ducks are resilient and they're going to find the best places to go and make the best of what the habitat allows. So.
The thing about it is what we can imagine, just because, as you pointed out, Joel, the condition doesn't allow it. I mean, you look back to the last great years when everybody was happy with the number of ducks they saw, 2010 to 2014.
Yeah.
Well, what did those years have in common? We started wet, we stayed wet, pretty much through that whole period.
Yeah.
And that's not the condition we're in.
Yeah.
So I think, am I hopeful that there's going to be pockets of good production? Yeah, but again, Prairie Canada is still awful dry. And we attracted a heck of again, the Eastern Dakotas have been fortress North America for breeding ducks here for pretty much a decade. And, listen, you'd rather have 100 ducks doing well than 50 ducks doing well, right? And yes, production can overwhelm lower breeding numbers, but it's just hard to imagine that while there may be some optimism, I think there is. Southern Saskatchewan got wetter. Southern Alberta got a lot wetter. Southwestern Manitoba seemed to do pretty well through the breeding season. Eastern Dakotas, South Dakotas probably has as good a water conditions now than they've had going into the fall in 10 years. So, there should be some good carryover water. There'll be pockets of good production, but I'm like Frank. I can't imagine we ain't back to 2010 to 2014.
Yeah.
We're just not. We didn't have the starting condition to provide that huge super crop of young ducks in the fall flight.
Right.
There'll be pockets, but it's not. I don't think we're a long way from that.
Yep.
Lucky Duck is a proud partner of Delta Waterfowl. While being an industry leader in waterfowl motion decoys is their focus, they have the hunter in mind when designing all of their products. From their 5-star crash-rated Lucky Duck kennel to their full line of predator hunting gear, they are committed to serving the hunter 365 days a year. Check out their wonderful line of products at www.luckyduck.com or at a local retailer near you. Yeah, blueing teal.
Yeah, that's
another not so great story.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say out of maybe concern for the species, but in terms of hunting regulations, that's kind of maybe not a great news story down.
Yeah.
Right? So this year's teal season was reduced in days. Next year.
So we went from 16 to 9 this year based on last year's low teal count. Well, teal went down again. So, you're likely looking at another 9-day season. And for Louisiana and Texas and many southern states, blue wings are a great addition. They're early migrants and let's face it, they're the second most abundant duck in North America. And so to me, having that short of a teal season is crazy, but
pretty low harvest rates
and very low harvest rates. So that's unfortunate for southern hunters. So the good news for guys in Louisiana and Texas is that gadwall are still above the long-term average, well above their long-term average, and green-winged teal, gadwall and green-winged teal are a staple if you're in coastal Louisiana, and both of those ducks are doing fine. So they'll have a reasonable season. It won't be 2015 or 2014, but there'll be ducks in Louisiana. So
yeah, I think if I lived in the South, I'd get fired up for that blue-winged teal season.
It's fun, ton of fun.
I've never participated in it. For us, it's dove hunting.
Right.
We went out yesterday.
Right.
Did you make it out?
I didn't. I'm moving, so
Oh yeah,
I'm swamped.
you were swamped, loading trailers, things like that. So above the long-term average, gadwall, widgeon, shovelers, green-winged teal, redhead, cans. What do they all have in common?
I think mostly they're more stable water. So green wings, redheads, canvasbacks, parkland, or boreal for green wings. Gadwall like big water, and so when we are at half the pond numbers that we had in the peak years, the ponds that are dry are the small temporary ponds, and that's not where Gadwall
Right.
love. They're an odd dabbler in that respect, as are widgeon in a lot of ways. So both of those two species are more semi-permanent, bigger ponds, and so I think they have in common that their pond numbers don't look as bad as mallard and bluewing pond numbers do.
Right.
So,
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yep.
We maybe just a little. How many years did you teach at LSU,
20.
Louisiana State University? A
right.
lot of waterfowl ID, waterfowl ecology.
Yeah.
So we're going to put you on the spot and be the textbook. So,
Ooh.
well, we've referred to the Arctic and boreal, just
Yeah.
kind of as though it was kind of common knowledge.
Yeah.
What's the role of the Arctic and the boreal, Frank?
Well, the boreal is a safe place. It's always wet. You're never going to have a drought like we had in 2002 when we were,
Yep.
2.9 million ponds. They're always going to be there, and so it's a safe breeding area. And the Arctic is the same way. It doesn't dry out. Arctic breeding deltas actually have higher duck densities than even the prairie pothole region. Now they're tiny areas.
Right.
It's a tiny fraction, but it's a good nesting spot. We used to think that ducks went up there and had one and were done, and unfortunately we just haven't done enough work in the Arctic. But I'd argue that if it weren't for the Arctic, pintails would be in really poor shape because the prairies have changed so much in the last 20 years, particularly no-till agriculture leaving stubble on the landscape. And as John mentioned a while ago, we always used to think of pintails as breeding in the western drier prairies. And so in Saskatchewan, tall grass, native grass was 12 inches high. Well, wheat stubble is 10 inches high and looks like what they
Right.
what they think of as nesting habits. So they go out there, and we sort of thought they'd do fairly well until John Deere came along and plowed the eggs. And they have terrible nest success in that stubble. The predators are able to find them and destroy them. So they renest once, but they renest in the stubble. So that's been a real problem for pintails. Along with, pintails are a shallow water, temporary water. They're one of the few dabblers, for instance, that aren't territorial. And this is not known, but this is frank speculation that if your pond's going to dry up in 3 weeks, there's
Why
no
defend
point
it?
of defending it. It's gonna, you come there, you breed quickly, and then you take your ducklings to more stable water. So there's no point in defending this 4-inch deep water. So they really rely on shallow water, and those are the ponds that are easiest to drain. And we've seen lots and lots of that in the last 20 years. It's unfortunate. So
With the, just kind of, I don't know, for some reason I try to think of finances when I talk about something that everybody has in common. With the Arctic and the boreal, I kind of want to call them like a savings account.
Bond fund.
It's just something that's just there and it's stable and it just does what
Nice,
it does.
nice, consistent rate of return. Doesn't have the high variability that the prairies do. I mean, Johnny Lynch talked about this stuff a long time ago, right? And it'll never be your pathway to big, huge fall flights of ducks. We need the prairies being wet for that. But there's a number in some years big numbers of ducks that are breeding up there, and they just sort of do the thing, and it probably plays a pretty important role sort of in the sort of big population scales of ducks. And again, it doesn't drive the big fall flights. We know the prairies do that, but there's production and survival that's happening up there every year that contributes something to the overall North American duck population.
Yep, for sure.
So it may not set the ceiling, but it sets the floor.
It may well, yeah.
Right.
Okay. We want to continue the conversation, but we don't want to ignore the eastern or the western portions of the continent. So the eastern survey area, water up, ducks up. John, do you have some more details?
Well, yeah. The beautiful thing about if you're a duck hunter in the Atlantic flyway is drought's a thing you don't concern yourself with the way we do here in the prairies. The eastern breeding grounds, way more consistent water-wise. Yeah, they get drier and they get wetter, but generally it's a pretty narrow window in term, or you use the ceiling and the floor analogy, way closer to the mean, right?
Ceiling and the floor are pretty close to each other.
Pretty close to each other. It's
Right.
more of a crawl space than a two-story loft. Um, no change for eastern mallards, which is great news. It wasn't that long ago that we were talking about
Very worried.
restrictive,
Yeah.
big declines in eastern mallards. The regulation change, more restrictive regulations. Mallards a little bit below average, but staying sort of at par. Black ducks declined a little bit this year, 6% down this year in comparison, but they're still above the long-term average. So black ducks, probably Frank talked about canvasbacks being remarkably stable. I wonder if eastern black ducks don't fall into that category, especially if we look at the last 20 years, Frank.
Yeah, the last 20 years. I mean, for a while there, they were really declining, and then they seem to come out of that decline, and it's been a great success story in a lot of ways. So,
Green wings were down 24%, but just a modest change from the long-term average. Ringnecks were up both in terms of the change from last year and a little bit above the long-term average. And ringnecks are really important in the Atlantic flyway because they're one of the key duck species in this multi-stock harvest model that they use. So ringnecks population trends are in the Dakotas, or in the traditional survey area, we have to make 9 phone calls to get a ringneck estimate. In the eastern Dakotas, they're super important. Golden eyes had a big decline, 25% decline year over year, but sort of no major change from the long-term average. And mergansers were virtually unchanged from last year, but considerably above the long-term average. Golden eyes are another species that hunters probably don't talk about in terms of their population trends, but again, that's another species that's in that multi-stock model, so it has real importance to how we're setting regulations in the Atlantic flyway.
Okay, good. That was a good overview. How about the Pacific?
Well, I mean, if we're looking for good news, and I think we always kind of are, California having their mallards come back is good news. And California is, they've had some years where it looked like maybe this was the year mallards were going to break through a little bit. But drought and lots of other challenges there have been a bit of a challenge over the time. I've got to get I don't speak off the wrongly here.
Local ducks in California are awfully important. Mallards, it's surprising. We think of mallards in the central flyway all coming from the north, but in California, a good 70% of mallards that are shot in California are raised in California, and that's equally true for Oregon and Washington. So the state surveys out west are pretty important, and for mallards to make a nice recovery in California, that's a big deal. Yeah,
so mallards were up 49% from a year ago, and that estimate at 178,000 is pretty darn low.
Yeah.
And so up to 266,000, big increase, 49% increase, but still 17% above the long-term average. But it's nice to see some good news come out of California. Total duck numbers were up too, not quite as big as mallards, up 27%. As Frank mentioned, mallards, local breeding mallards are really important to hunters there, but so are gadwall and cinnamon teal and other species that are raised in California. They're still 12% below the long-term average, but generally much better news than we've been accustomed to out of California.
Well, it was really, really dry out there just a couple of years ago, and then it flipped maybe a bit too wet all at once.
Right. Yeah.
Had a lot of dry infrastructure cracks, and then you bring that water back, and I think in some of those areas it's that it was a little bit too much too fast. But the upside of that is, the ducks are going to respond. So that's fantastic news. Well, wrapping things up, I think this is always the challenge. We find ourselves in this situation every year. We're going, okay, what's your fall flight forecast? Maybe not in numbers, but just in a more of a qualitative opinion. And I think we always get stuck in this one, is that no one likes to be negative. We always want to be optimistic. But one of the things that we decided that we were going to do this year is let's just be not brutally honest, but let's be honest. And so I'm going to challenge you guys both to, take the good with the bad, throw it into a bag, shake it up. And Frank, what's your take on the fall flight?
I'd say it's going to be fair to good. It's not going to be great, but the fact that hunters get to shoot 3 pintails, I think that'll be really exciting. And so I think it'll be fair. I'd be excited to be out hunting if I were back in Louisiana hunting again. So.
Well, you had mentioned a couple real bright spots there: the green-winged teal and gadwall.
Green wings and gadwalls are key to Louisiana, coastal Louisiana hunting, and they're still above long-term average, or gadwall are well above long-term average. So, and widgeon are great to see in your decoys, and really fun, cool ducks, and they're doing great, and so it's not going to be a terrible year. It's not going to be a bumper year like we had,
Right.
10 years ago. So,
Yeah, I think we all look for things to be optimistic about. We're duck hunters, right? It'd be hard to get up at 4:30 in the morning to go every morning if you thought it was going to be crappy. So we all have a bit of sort of hardwired optimism in us. And yeah, there's some bright spots. I think the water coming the way it came late, the signal we got from the North Dakota Game and Fish. I don't know how transportable that that result is, but there's going to be pockets of good duck production. But again, I think it's hard. It's hard to. There's no way we can get back to those big, huge fall flights we saw in 2010, 2011, 2012. 2013, 2014. We just didn't have the framework for it. Now the good news is, if we're going to be optimistic, maybe the thing we should be most optimistic about is Southern Alberta. It's done nothing but rain in Southern Alberta since the 20th of June. Southern Saskatchewan wetland conditions are probably better today than they were this time last year, and the Eastern Dakotas certainly are in better conditions. So maybe we're setting the table, not so much for this fall flight and the production that came this year, but maybe we're trending towards next spring, where we have much better news to report, bigger pond numbers, increasing numbers of things like mallards that have been in a decline. So that's what I'm most optimistic about. Not that we're going to have a bumper fall flight of ducks this year. I just don't think that it's in the cards, but hopeful that we can build off of those late rains we had pretty widespread across the prairies, and hope for next year. The thing I'm most concerned about is a guy that grew up as a bluebill hunter in Minnesota. That one worries me.
That's trouble.
That one jumped off the page and was frankly a gut punch.
Yeah.
And really unfortunate. But again, Fortress Eastern Dakota has sort of fallen apart even for Scott now, and we'll see what the end result of that decline is.
One of the bright spots we didn't mention are ringnecks. You look at ringnecks, and Lord knows why they can't be in the survey now. Traditionally they weren't very important, but in terms of duck range and numbers, they have expanded more than any other duck in North America. They've expanded. They've replaced scaup and many of the western transects. The flight lines where we count ducks, and they are doing great. And I have the luxury of going to Louisiana around Thanksgiving and hunting, and the ringnecks are just fabulous and so much fun. So that's another bright spot for guys in the South. Ringnecks are the number one diver in every single flyway, and so why they're not in this report, as John said, we can find the data, but it takes a whole bunch of phone calls and bugging the folks in Maryland at Migratory Birds to give us the data. But ringnecks did well, and again expanded, and so that's a bright spot as well.
Yeah, for me, I agree with everything you guys said. I absolutely do. I think if you're looking at ducks, just duck hunting, and you don't really discern in the bag, I do think that there's reason for optimism.
Yeah.
So let's call it an average year. Be willing to be open-minded to be surprised. But one of the things that I guess the one big question mark that I have is I've never seen ducks settling in southern Canada as being a really good thing. The production, take the same population of ducks in the Dakotas and the same ones in Canada, and in the Dakotas they're going to outperform every single year. So that's the one shadow of doubt for me, is how good can production be in southern Canada? That's my
The only
just
thing,
not sure there.
the only thing I'll say is, at least in the grassland portion, we were sort of joking about it earlier this morning. Those places have been so dry for so long that you could have a surge in production in some of those places.
Yeah.
In the grasslands, now the parklands we know have perennially low nest success and
Yeah.
pretty crummy annual output. But those grasslands, some of those grassland areas have been dry for so long. I don't know if a cricket could live in some of those places, right? So there may be places and again, not knowing exactly where they found those pockets of good water, there may be pockets up there of really good production. What we really need to get Prairie Canada cranking is it's got to be crazy wet. When you have the kind of water we had in again, going back, I'm sounding like a broken record, but 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, those years, Prairie Canada was so wet. Even some of the more beat up landscapes are having great production. So, but again, we're a long way from that.
Joel, I tend to agree with you. When I was coming through school, we were all told that the ducks come out of Canada and the Dakotas are irrelevant. And then 15, 20 years ago, we realized, gosh, the Dakotas are producing more ducks than Prairie Canada.
On a per capita basis.
When we had the trifecta of fox falling out of the system, large areas of eastern North Dakota, Towner County, where we did work, 80% of the landscape was grass from CRP. So you had a ton of water, relatively few predators, and a lot of grass. That was a great recipe. But one of the other cool studies that came along maybe a dozen years ago is we discovered here in the Great Plains, and particularly the Ducks Unlimited Great Plains Regional Office, that when we have wet after prolonged dry, we get great production.
Mm-hmm.
And there are two hypotheses, and they're probably both partially correct, is that a couple of things happen. As John mentioned, when it's dry, things have a hard time. And if you are a predator that doesn't migrate south, you can't get away from the dry.
Right.
And so duck numbers are driven by nest success. Well, nest success is probably high after a drought because the predator numbers are way low. We've seen that on trap blocks, that in drought years we catch half as many predators.
Right.
I'm
Sure.
generalizing a bit here, but so you get two things. You get this incredible surge of productivity because the ponds have dried out, produced a bunch of vegetation. Now it's flooded, and that produces the duck soup that feeds the invertebrates that feed ducks. And so you get great production because of there's tons of food and there aren't predators. And so John may be right that you might be seeing some better production out of the grasslands of the southern Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba than you're used to.
I want to be surprised.
Hope so.
Yes, absolutely. We all want to be surprised, and we're all hopeful.
Right.
Hope springs eternal. That's why we have this. We do this every year.
Yep.
For that reason, need to get the insight. Thank you guys for your time again. If this is the first listening you've had to this subject for this year, we have a press release out there. We have I think it's about a 5-minute video. You guys talking about
It's a little more than 5 minutes. We can never do anything.
5 minutes is impossible.
So thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. And
Yeah.
obviously for the listener, if they have any questions, they can call the office and speak to any one of us, anybody on staff for
Give us
a
a
little
call.
deeper dive. So
Sounds great.
all right.
Thanks.
Good stuff.
Bet.
Thanks, Joel.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.